This is the BioCentury Show. The BioCentury Show is brought to you by the second BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Biopharma Summit. Join us October 2nd to 4th in Kendall Square to debate how to globalize biopharma innovation to benefit patients and achieve an ROI for investors.
Hello and welcome to the BioCentury Show. I'm Simone Fishburn, Editor-in-Chief at BioCentury. I'm joined today by Klaus Romero, Chief Scientific Officer of the Critical Path Institute. Dr. Romero, a clinical scientist, has been at the Critical Path Institute for nearly 16 years, took the role of CSO in March 2020. He's been instrumental in building its capabilities, establishing the quantitative medicine program, and growing the organization's portfolio of consortia and public-private partnerships. You've done a lot more than that, Dr. Romero, but I'm going to stop there because I think I need to ask the first question. I think many people in our audience might not know a lot about the Critical Path Institute. I think it's sometimes said that you are the best kept secret in drug development. Can you give us a quick overview of the Institute's mission and what you do?
Oh, absolutely, and that's a great question. And definitely, we don't want to be kept secret of any kind. So it's in our name. Our name is a direct answer to the call to action from the FDA's Critical Path Initiative document. The first version came out in 2004. The Institute was incorporated in 2005 with the name, the Critical Path Institute, as the nonprofit that would support FDA in materializing the vision of the Critical Path Initiative. So that's the origin. But what does that mean? What is it that we do? So we generate the legal infrastructure, the scientific infrastructure, and the regulatory infrastructure to generate a very unique neutral environment where pharma companies, academicians, and regulatory agencies can come to that neutral environment and share information that they would not be able to share otherwise. That information typically takes the form of data from preclinical experiments, translational experiments, and importantly, clinical trials that we integrate with information from patient level information from observational studies from academia, registries from patient groups, and electronic health records to then transform those data into actionable solutions that can remove very tangibly identified bottlenecks in the process of drug development so that the process is leveled for everyone, so that the companies, when they come out of the neutral environment that we provide, can concentrate on competing on the products without worrying that the process has inefficiencies that is going to plague the success rates of their efforts. That is the summary of what we do.
So we've talked about this before. One of your big things is resolving bottlenecks. I want to talk about some of your wins. So maybe you can, I know you've had some wins, for example, in biomarkers with polycystic kidney disease. Maybe you can tell us about that and maybe walk us through the process. How do you go about building consensus and advancing, I don't know if I want to call that an issue, but advancing a program or a project such as that?
Right. No, great question. So it all starts with the identifying what the bottleneck is, because that's scientifically the question you want to address. So the first thing is having the assurance that in listening to all the stakeholders, industry, regulators, patient advocacy groups, and the academic experts, that we can articulate those perceived bottlenecks into regulatory grade scientific terminology, so regulatory science terminology. That means asking the right question. That's what that really translates to. Once you have the right question asked, you can then think about the kind of solution or the kind of answer that you need for that question. In other words, what does the solution look like to remove this bottleneck? Once you understand what the solution looks like, then you can line up the kind of data that you need, the kind of data analytics that you need, and the kind of regulatory strategy that you need to follow to ensure that the solution gets the proper endorsement by regulators so that the solution can get adopted by industry. And an important aspect of that is making sure that there will be enough interest in the value proposition to get the necessary funding to move things forward. So the victories that you mentioned had to do with identifying very clearly what the unmet needs were and generating those very specific solutions to those bottlenecks. I'll stop with that for now.
So that's a lot of, I don't know if I want to say cats that you have to herd or giants that you have to, manage. And I'm trying to, your own bottlenecks in that process. Is it agreeing on what the issue is, the biomarker, for example, or once you're in there, do you have really diverse issues, or different people have different stakes in it? Is that an issue as well? How are you? Seems to me that you're sort of a little bit of a diplomat in all of this.
We totally are diplomats, but we also approach this, and for those of us with a clinical background, that comes in really handy for these conversations because it's like establishing a diagnosis.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the companies voicing their headaches that they're having, and the regulatory agencies voicing the issues that they're seeing, and you're having the patient community voicing what their unmet needs are. And then you need to bring that all together in a proper articulation of what the real underlying problem is. Because a lot of times what is being voiced are symptoms of the underlying problem, but not the problem itself. So just saying, oh, we're going to advance a biomarker, maybe a biomarker might be a solution, but let's start with understanding what the problem really is. And a lot of times what you need is not necessarily a biomarker, because the real problem is not the lack of a biomarker, but the lack of an understanding of how to implement a biomarker in a properly designed trial. Other times,
so let's come back to polycystic kidney disease. Why was that one an area that you were able to find consensus and move ahead? What's so important there?
Right. No, great question. So an orphan status indication, right? Where before the existence of the public-private partnership, there was essentially no specifically approved therapy to either slow or stop disease progression for those individuals. Okay, so what was the issue? The issue was essentially that people could not really design trials to test new medications properly because the community was lacking a metric that would answer two questions. The first one, how do I know which individuals to put in a trial? Well, yeah, you need to have the diagnosis of polycystic kidney disease. Yeah. And so that's where total kidney volume, which is an imaging biomarker that tells you what the status of the disease is, becomes really relevant. But you can't just say, oh, because it tells you what the volumes of the kidney are, then that's the end of the story. No, you needed to build a quantitative machinery that allowed you to link what the baseline total kidney volume information was telling you about projections and predictions of what would happen with the disease later. That was the first thing that we advanced. Later on, because we had built that machinery and we were understanding the longitudinal dynamics of TKV, industry adopted that solution after FDA qualified the biomarker for that use, a prognostic use. And the trial of the first drug that eventually got approved for this indication was successful. And then in looking at the data from that specific trial and the additional machinery that we had built, the FDA designated total kidney volume as a reasonably likely surrogate, which represented not just a victory for that product that was the first to get approved, but also for the entire community, because now there's a really healthy pipeline of new medications under development.
So I'm going to stay for one more question with that particular example. And, what I want to kind of get at is if, there's biotechs out there that are watching, or listening, how do they interact with you? So what was the origin of selecting the biomarker for polycystic kidney disease? Is that something that sort of came from industry, from companies saying we can't develop drugs, or, how does it start?
Another great question. So it actually started from the patient community. So the PKD Foundation worked very closely with industry, and they understood what the symptoms of the problem were. And then they talked to the FDA. The FDA encouraged them to come talk to us. And then we brought them all together, and we provided the articulation of the unmet need, the vision for the solution, and with the entire ecosystem involved, we were able to push the solutions through the finish line.
Okay, well, this is a great segue to my next question, which is, you've really been instrumental in bringing the patient voice forward in clinical trial assessments. I'm sure that's a continued area of focus for you. So where does it need to go from here? And one thing I want to ask you is whether there are actually drawbacks in this. What are the dangers or hurdles, or what's the degree to which patients are contributing, but I don't know if it exposes them or creates false hopes? And just one reason that I ask this question is that we have some diseases where the patient communities are really, really active. ALS is one. I mean, historically, HIV, and they've been very successful. And of course, there's many diseases that are equally worthy that don't really necessarily have such a unified patient community. So maybe you can talk a little bit about how you work with patient communities and if there are complexities there.
Well, that's a great question. There's a lot to unpack with that one. So first and foremost, this concept of patient-focused drug development is an area that we completely embrace for everything and anything that we do. It is also recognized as one of the main regulatory science priorities for the FDA. So that is absolutely recognized there. So much so that the development and the assessment of clinical outcome assessment instruments and solutions is identified as one of our core competencies. So that's the recognition of how important this is. But then the question is, how do you incorporate that voice of the patient into drug development conversations? So first is the understanding of those clinical outcome assessments. That's a great way to get the patient community involved, because they're the ones who can unequivocally inform anybody as to what are the clinically meaningful aspects of a given disease that are truly affecting the way they feel, the way they function, and the way they survive. That's a fundamental opportunity rather than a threat or a disadvantage. Now, that said, you're right. There are some communities that have the benefit of having established groups and having an ecosystem that raises the loudness of their voice, which is great. And we, of course, welcome the collaboration from any and all of those groups. But there are specific conditions or therapeutic areas that don't necessarily have that benefit. Point in case, some of the more rare diseases than others. And so for that, we have a great partnership with the National Organization for Rare Disorders through the development of a data and analytics platform that allows us to integrate all different kinds of sources of data to then transform those data into actionable solutions to accelerate drug development across rare diseases. That effort is called RDCA-DAP, the Rare Disease Cures Accelerator Data and Analytics Platform. So I hope that gave you kind of a flavor of how we incorporate the voice of the patient into our work.
Thank you. Well, we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, I'm going to ask you some more questions about the Critical Path Institute.
Perfect.
Emerging biopharma companies in the US, Europe, and Asia face the same dilemma. How do you globalize to deliver innovation to patients and reward investors? A handful of biopharma companies will build global operations. Most will achieve global economics through partnering and licensing. Others will capture a share of the economics by enabling global development and financings. This October in Kendall Square, BioCentury and BayHelix once again bring together decision makers and investors to address these industry challenges and to form trusted cross-border relationships. Register today at biocenturyeastwest.com.
We are back at the BioCentury Show with Klaus Romero, Chief Scientific Officer at the Critical Path Institute. When we spoke previously, you mentioned that rare and orphan diseases are a priority area at the Critical Path Institute. Now, I have to tell you, and this won't be welcome, but one of the things I'm hearing as I go out and talk to investors and drug developers is that that area is going to become a little bit more out of favor, some people think, because pricing pressures and various other factors. So I imagine that unraveling bottlenecks or solving bottlenecks is one way that, might continue or might spur interest to continue. But can you talk a little bit about what the Critical Path Institute is doing that might actually keep people involved and thinking about rare diseases in terms of drug development?
Oh, absolutely. And that another great question. So first, let me just provide that clarity that at CPATH, we're not favoring rare diseases over non-rare diseases. We equally treat them with the same amount of respect and commitment. Now, the areas where we step into work are those areas where the factors align, where we can get the communities galvanized to identify and properly articulate the unmet needs, describe the solutions, and get moving to integrate the data that we need to integrate in order to build the necessary solutions. If you think about our history, we've typically tackled areas that are problem children for drug development. Alzheimer's disease is having a lot of momentum now. There was a time when everybody was thinking that probably people were going to fully divest from Alzheimer's disease drug development because of the failure rates. Now that has completely turned. So we're, of course, happy and proud that the Alzheimer's community works with us the way they do. Same with the polycystic kidney disease example. I mean, people were kind of ready to quit on a lot of efforts. Now there's a healthy pipeline and the first drug that was approved. So we don't shy away from those big challenges. Now, of course, the factors need to align, and where the factors align, we go full force, full steam ahead, rare or non-rare disease, to make sure that we provide those solutions for industry, the patients, and the regulators.
Now, another area we've talked about is regenerative therapies. Can you talk a little bit about your activities there?
Right. So certainly regenerative therapies, that cell-based therapies, gene-based therapies, are a very important area where a lot of the concentration of drug development is moving to, and we can't ignore that. In diseases that are genetically driven or that have a very strong genetic susceptibility component, those types of therapies provide a great deal of opportunity. But at the same time, because of the innovative nature of those technologies that could turn into medical products one day, there's quite a bit of challenges with figuring out how to properly design and execute trials for in that kind of a setting. In that kind of a setting where you probably need to intervene very early in life and where the benefit is only going to be actually observable years later, that kind of breaks the classic clinical trial design paradigm right there. But at the same time, where are the opportunities? The opportunities are in having a discussion about those technologies, embracing all the areas of investment and importance that have been recognized. Patient-focused drug development, modeling-informed drug development, biomarker-based design clinical trials, clinical outcome measures that actually capture clinically meaningful aspects of the disease journey. A lot of aspects about innovative and complex trial designs, real-world data and real-world evidence, the entire notion of artificial intelligence and drug development. That's where the opportunities lie for, in a public-private partnership setting, make sure that we have the generation of tangible solutions to those unanswered questions so that drug development can move full force in that direction.
Well, I want to stay with one particular question in that area, which is gene editing. Now, that has certainly captured the attention of the public, even beyond investors and drug developers. But of course, there are significant safety hurdles, especially when it's used in vivo. As you know, you can get off-target edits. That's a big concern. So I'm wondering, is that an area where the Critical Path Institute plays? And how do you think the field can get to a position of safety and agreement on what safety looks like?
Right. So the agency is way more visionary than probably the community gives the agency credit for. They clearly have recognized the importance of transforming translational sciences. Because sure, making sure that you have a very solid both efficacy and safety foundation for generation of evidence in the clinical stage of development is fantastic. Absolutely no question about that. But for these types of questions, it's really important that we figure out the translational piece and how to understand what tools and solutions are really needed in the preclinical stages so that they can properly translate, not just for efficacy, but importantly, in these kinds of safety areas. The agency recognizes that, and we have an effort which is starting to gain a lot of momentum for that transformational translational science is not just linked to gene editing or any particular type of technology, but holistically, how can we help modernize and transform those paradigms for translatability? And that aspect of safety is a critical component of that. And our predictive safety testing consortium is all in that effort.
So one thing that has come up in and since COVID is this idea of global regulatory standards. Now, you say that you talk to regulators. I assume that's not only FDA, because you have a branch in Europe, right? So is the EMA involved in your discussions and so on? You know, it was very evident with vaccines and some of the therapeutics that with vaccines and some of the therapeutics that, you know, different regulators across the world would look at things differently. What are your thoughts about that? And is it really realistic to think about global labels, you know, maybe even if it's just in the paradigm of an emergency like a pandemic?
Right. That's a great question. So I can speak for our very direct experience in talking to directly FDA, EMA, PMDA, and in certain instances, even Swissmedic, Health Canada, TGA. So if you really peel the onion, and in the safety of the neutral environment that we provide, that's when you can peel the onion. Scientifically and clinically speaking, we have seen very little to no disagreement at all from the individuals involved in these conversations from the different agencies regarding the articulation of the unmet need, the nature of the solutions, and the path to get there. Now, it's one thing for them to have consensus regarding the science and the clinical considerations, but then once that conversation occurs, it needs to then be put into context with the way the laws and regulations are set up in the different jurisdictions. And that's really the part where the contextualization of that scientific and clinical agreement may look like disagreement, but it's not really disagreement on the science or the clinical aspects. It's just that once you put that in the context of the way the laws and the regulations in the different jurisdictions are set up, you can't ignore that. So if somebody wants to do an effort to work on the political side of things and change some of those statutes and regulations, by all means, that's not part of our mission. We're very much on making sure that the science is sound and that drug development can be accelerated, even when you need to put things in the specific context of the laws and regulations and jurisdictions for FDA, EMA, PMDA, etc. But once you have the scientific and clinical agreements, it makes it easier to put that in the context of what each regulatory agency has in terms of their background for statutes, regulations, etc.
Well, I think we, can't have a whole session where we don't talk about data science, not in 2023. Now, obviously, machine learning and AI have tremendous ability to change how drug development is done. They're gonna, I think, unravel some of those bottlenecks. Is that an area you're working in? And I also want to ask you, what changes you anticipate, and if there are caveats or things that concern you?
Oh, great question. So model-informed drug development is another one of our core competencies. And we've been working on that since I joined back in 2008. Now, the types of models that can inform drug development have also evolved. And we play in the space of pretty much every single one of those types of modeling approaches. Statistics, pharmacometrics, systems pharmacology, PBPK models, PK/PD, we definitely work in that space. But since about 2017, 2018, we started getting into artificial intelligence. Even before that was the big buzzword that it is today for drug development. The important thing there is that you need to understand what's the question, how do you get to an answer to that question? What's the unmet need? What's the solution? Sometimes a quote unquote simpler statistics modeling approach can get you to that answer. By all means, use that. But sometimes you need the sophistication that AI provides to generate novel hypotheses, for example, or to identify interplay between variables that you would not be able to identify otherwise. Those are key opportunities for AI, and we've been working very judiciously in that space to understand how to best position AI as a source of tangible drug development solutions. One example of that is an effort that we have funded by the FDA in real-world data and real-world evidence, where there's a strong component of AI to put that in a context. And importantly, it is in the premature neonates space. So what I find really excited about that one is that typically you think, drug development in adults, maybe they'll move it to pediatrics and maybe they'll move it to neonates. Here it's the opposite. It's the neonates making things happen and then everybody else learning from that.
Well, that is super cool and also a great way to end this on a very optimistic note. We're out of time, but it has been a pleasure talking with you. And we certainly look forward to seeing the next bottlenecks that are solved by the Critical Path Institute. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Simone. Thanks, everybody.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by the second BioCentury Bay Helix East-West Biopharma Summit. Join us October 2nd to 4th in Kendall Square to debate how to globalize biopharma innovation to benefit patients and achieve an ROI for investors.